My family laughed like I'd inherited an old sock instead of business. They laughed like I'd inherited an old sock instead of business. The attorney's office went silent for exactly 3 seconds after he announced my inheritance, just long enough for everyone to process what they'd heard, before my family erupted into laughter that bounced off the mahogany panels. Daniel Winters, the attorney, had said with his super formal voice, adjusting his glasses like he was about to announce I'd won the lottery, "Your uncle has left you his establishment, the Route 19 diner, along with the property it sits on and all assets contained therein." My brother James slapped his knee so hard I thought he'd bruise himself. My sister Helen covered her mouth, but her eyes gave away how hilarious she found this whole situation. Even my Aunt Margaret, who normally maintained that proper lady composure at all times, was struggling to keep it together. I sat there in that leather chair that probably cost more than my car, completely blindsided. Uncle Frank had passed 3 weeks ago, and I'd been the only one who actually visited him regularly during his final year. Not because I was fishing for inheritance. The man had stories about 1970s America that would make your hair stand on end. He lived through some wild times, and unlike the rest of my family, I actually enjoyed listening. Well, Danny boy, James finally managed between chuckles, wiping an actual tear from his eye, "You always did have a thing for old junk." The way he said it made it clear he wasn't just talking about the diner. Helen leaned over, her designer purse probably worth more than this mysterious diner I'd just inherited. "Just don't come asking us for money to fix up that dump," she whispered, not quite quietly enough. The attorney pretended not to hear, shuffling papers with sudden interest. Of course, neither James nor Helen had any reason to complain about their inheritances. James had gotten Uncle Frank's downtown condo, prime real estate worth at least $500,000. Helen received a portfolio of blue-chip stocks and a vacation cabin in the Poconos. Even my cousins hadn't been forgotten, each receiving generous cash gifts. It seemed everyone had gotten something valuable, except me. My Uncle Robert, Frank's younger brother, was the only one who wasn't openly laughing. He just gave me this weird look and said, "Maybe it's good you got that old shack. At least nobody will fight you for it." Something in his tone made my stomach tighten, like there was a joke I wasn't on, or maybe something worse. 2 days later, I drove my beat-up Honda along the forgotten stretch of Route 19. The GPS kept trying to reroute me back to the interstate, as if it couldn't believe anyone would willingly drive this road. The asphalt was cracked, with weeds fighting their way through like nature was slowly reclaiming its territory. When I finally saw it, I almost drove past. A faded, peeling box of a building with a flickering neon sign that just said, "Eat." The E was completely dead, so it really just announced "at" to the empty highway. Even the crows seemed to avoid the place, which should have been my second warning. I parked in the empty lot, dust swirling around my ankles as I stepped out. The smell hit me immediately, that unique mix of old grease, dust, and abandonment. The kind of smell that tells you something's been left to die a slow death. The key felt heavy in my hand as I approached the front door. It stuck in the lock, requiring a solid shoulder push before the door creaked open with a sound straight out of a horror movie. A chunk of plaster chose that exact moment to fall from the ceiling, barely missing my head and exploding into dust on the floor. "Welcome home," I muttered to myself, flipping a light switch that surprisingly still worked. Fluorescent lights flickered reluctantly to life, revealing a classic 50s style diner frozen in time. Red vinyl booths cracked with age. A counter with chrome-edged stools. An ancient jukebox in the corner that probably hadn't played Elvis since Elvis was still alive. My phone rang, the screen showing family group chat, which really meant everyone who was laughing at me 2 days ago. "So how's your empire looking?" James didn't even bother with a hello. I could hear Helen in the background, saying something about tetanus shots. I looked around at the dust-covered surfaces, the menu board still advertising hamburgers for prices that hadn't been current since the Reagan administration. "It's got potential." The laughter on the other end made my jaw clench. "Just close it up and forget about it, Danny," Helen chimed in, having apparently grabbed the phone. "That highway's been dead since the interstate went in. You couldn't pay people to drive out there." She's right, James added. Sell the land for whatever you can get and move on. That's what Uncle Frank should have done 20 years ago. It's not like you need to worry about making it successful like the rest of us have to maintain our properties. I heard what he wasn't saying. James was already planning renovations for the condo, and Helen had been researching property management companies for the cabin. They both gotten assets that would appreciate in value with minimal effort. Meanwhile, I'd gotten a full-time job disguised as an inheritance. Something in me snapped. Maybe it was a dismissive tone. Maybe it was being called Danny again, a nickname I'd been trying to shake since high school. Or maybe it was a realization that they'd all written off Uncle Frank's life's work without a second thought. I'll figure it out, I said, and hung up before they could respond. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the dusty windows, I sat at the counter on one of the old stools. I'd spent hours just cleaning, and had barely made a dent. My hands were dirty, my back ached, and that little voice in my head kept asking what the hell I thought I was doing. The place was a mess. The kitchen equipment was ancient. The plumbing made suspicious groaning sounds. And yet, something about this place felt like it was waiting, not dying, but hibernating. In the fading light, I noticed a framed photo behind the counter I'd missed earlier. I wiped away the dust with my thumb to reveal a much younger Uncle Frank standing proudly in front of this very diner. The sign was bright and new. The parking lot was full, and Frank had his arm around a woman I didn't recognize. They looked happy, successful. What had happened here? How did this thriving business become the punchline of a family joke? As I locked up that night, my phone buzzed with a text from my cousin Michael, who hadn't been at the reading. Heard about the diner. Call me before you do anything. There's stuff you should know. I stared at the message for a long time, standing in the empty parking lot as the old sign flickered above me. The warning in those words was clear, but so was something else. Confirmation that there was more to this inheritance than an old building on a forgotten highway. Back at my apartment, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Uncle Frank, about the diner, about my family's reaction. The pieces didn't fit together. Uncle Frank had never been rich, but he wasn't stupid either. He wouldn't have held on to a worthless property for decades without reason, and he definitely wouldn't have left it to me as some kind of cruel joke, which meant either the diner wasn't the worthless dump everyone claimed, or my family knew something they weren't telling me. Standing in my kitchen at 3 a.m., I made a decision. I wasn't going to sell. I wasn't going to walk away. I was going to figure out why my uncle left me this place, why my family was so quick to laugh it off, and what exactly my cousin Michael thought I needed to know. As I finally crawled into bed, one question kept circling in my mind. Which member of my family had the most to gain by making sure I never looked too closely at my unexpected inheritance? I finally managed to meet up with my cousin Michael at a coffee shop halfway between my apartment and his office. He'd been acting weird on the phone, constantly checking if anyone could hear our conversation, like we were planning a heist instead of discussing a rundown diner. "Look," he said, hunched over his $5 coffee, "there's something you should know about that property." But before he could elaborate, his phone buzzed. He checked it, face falling instantly. "I gotta go. Family emergency." The way he emphasized family made it clear which members were causing the emergency. Be careful, Daniel. That's all I'm saying. And just like that, I was left alone with cold coffee and more questions and answers. Later that week, I was heading to meet a contractor at the diner when I spotted a familiar Mercedes parked outside Giovanni's, this fancy Italian place downtown. James and Helen were sitting at one of those outdoor tables, looking like they'd stepped out a country club brochure. I was about to call out when something made me pause. Their body language was intense, huddled close, speaking in low voices. Nothing like the casual lunch you'd expect between siblings. I ducked behind a newspaper stand, feeling ridiculous but too curious to walk away. "He's been at that dump every day this week," Helen was saying, swirling her wine glass like she was auditioning for a movie, acting like he's going to turn it into the next big thing. James chuckled, that same condescending laugh from the attorney's office. "Let him play restaurant for a while. Once he realizes what a money pit it is, we'll offer to take it off his hands for pennies on the dollar." And if he doesn't want to sell? Helen asked, perfectly manicured nails tapping against the table. James's voice dropped even lower, but I caught it anyway. Then we remind him how the market works. No suppliers, no customers, no business. I felt like I had been punched. My own siblings were actively plotting against me, planning to let me fail, and then swoop in to take advantage. The casual cruelty of it made my coffee threaten to come back up. Back at the diner, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd overheard. Why did they care so much about this supposedly worthless property? What was I missing? I started going through the office and back, digging through decades of Uncle Frank's paperwork. Most of it was boring business stuff, old invoices, employee records, health inspection certificates. But stuffed in the back of a filing cabinet, I found something that made my heart skip. A faded photograph from what looked like the late 60s. My parents, young, beaming with pride, standing behind the counter of this very diner. Mom was wearing one of those classic waitress uniforms, and Dad had his arm around her shoulders, both of them looking at the camera like they owned the world. I'd never known they worked here. No one had ever mentioned it. Mom and Dad had died when I was in college. Car accident on a rainy night, and apparently they'd taken this piece of family history with them. For a long moment, I just stared at their faces, wondering what other connections to this place I didn't know about. Was this why Uncle Frank had left it to me? Some kind of family legacy I'd never been told about? Maybe they're right. I whispered to the empty diner, dust motes dancing in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. Maybe I am just a fool with dreams. But something about that photograph kept me from reaching for my phone to call a real estate agent. This wasn't just a building anymore. It was a mystery. My mystery. The next week was a blur of contractors' estimates and rapidly diminishing savings. Every expert who walked through the door gave me the same look. Part pity, part are you crazy? When the electrical guy told me the wiring was a lawsuit waiting to happen, and the plumber actually laughed at the state of the pipes, I started wondering if I was fighting a losing battle. But I'd be damned if I'd give James and Helen the satisfaction of seeing me fail so quickly. I took out a loan against my car and used every cent to start the renovations. Found a guy who specialized in restoring old diners, who seemed almost excited about bringing this place back to life. They don't make him like this anymore, he kept saying, running his hands over the original counter. This is Americana, man. The day they installed the new neon sign was the first time I felt like maybe, just maybe, this wasn't a complete disaster. The Highway Star Diner, it proclaimed in vibrant blue and red, with a little shooting star zipping across the top. We flipped the switch at dusk, holding our breath. It lit up like the 4th of July, humming with electricity, casting a neon glow across the empty parking lot. For about 30 seconds, I felt like a genius. Then came the pop, the sizzle, and half the sign went dark. Just my luck. Now it read the High Tar Diner, which sounded like a place that specialized in lung cancer rather than comfort food. I punched the wall so hard I left a dent in the drywall. Why is everything fighting against me? The sign guy looked uncomfortable. I can fix it, but it'll be another week. Supply chain issues, you know. Supply chain issues. Right. Those issues started popping up everywhere. The vinyl for the booth seats was back-ordered. The kitchen equipment deliveries were delayed. The food distributors kept losing my applications for accounts. After the 5th supplier gave me the runaround, I started getting suspicious. A quick call to an old college buddy who worked in restaurant supply confirmed my worst fears. Someone's been calling around, man, telling vendors you're a credit risk, that the place is going to be condemned. They're scaring people off. I didn't have to ask who someone was. The real question was how far they were willing to go to sabotage me. That question was answered the next day when Helen happened to stop by the diner during renovations. She looked ridiculously out of place in her designer outfit, picking her way across the dusty floor like she was navigating a minefield. "Wow, you're really going through with this," she said, not bothering to hide her surprise. Her eyes scanned the half-finished renovations with barely concealed disdain. "What do you want, Helen?" I was in the mood for family bonding. She shrugged, examining her perfect manicure. "Just Checking in. James mentioned he's been helping you with some supplier contacts. The casual way she dropped this confirmation of their sabotage made my blood boil. Helping me? Is that what you call it? Helen had the audacity to look confused. I just suggested he save you some time on your project. Her pause before project said everything about what she thought of my efforts. No point wasting resources on ideas that aren't viable. The conversation deteriorated from there when she left, dropping some comment about how they'd be there for me when I came to my senses. I had to resist the urge to throw something through the window. That night, sitting in the empty diner with takeout Chinese and a legal pad full of dwindling options, I finally faced truth. My family wasn't just doubting me. They were actively trying to make me fail. The question was why. What made this seemingly worthless property so important that they'd go to these lengths? I stared at the photograph of my parents, now framed and sitting on the counter. What aren't they telling me about this place? Whatever it was, I wasn't going to find out by playing their game. If the big suppliers wouldn't work with me, I needed another angle. Route 19 cut through miles of farmland before hitting the interstate. Small farms. Family operations that probably couldn't get the time of day from the big restaurant chains my brother worked with. Maybe that was my edge. While James was schmoozing with industrial food distributors, I could go directly to the source. Farm to table wasn't just a trendy concept. For me, it might be the only option left. First thing tomorrow, I'd start reaching out to local farmers. People who, like me, had probably been overlooked or pushed aside by the bigger players in the game. If my own family wanted to throw me under the bus, I said to the empty diner, raising my coffee cup in a mock toast, then I'll find people who actually believe in what I'm doing. The path forward wasn't clear yet, but one thing was certain. This wasn't just about a diner anymore. This was about finding out what my family was hiding and proving them wrong in the process. My first attempt at winning over local farmers went about as well as my high school prom invitation. I'd driven out to Green Valley Farm, a sprawling operation run by the same family since before World War II. The main house looked like something from a Norman Rockwell painting, complete with a porch swing and an ancient retriever dozing in the sun. The owner, Ed Wilcox, listened to my pitch with the same expression my dad used to have when I tried explaining why I needed to borrow the car at midnight. Arms crossed, eyebrows raised, suspicion written all over his weathered face. "Let me get this straight," he said, after I'd rambled on for 10 minutes about my vision. "You want me to sell my produce to your diner instead of the distributors I've been working with for 20 years? Standing there with my hat literally in my hands, I admitted that yes, that was exactly what I was asking. And yes, I couldn't pay what the big companies could. And yes, I understood it sounded crazy. "It's not just about money," I explained, trying not to sound desperate. "Your tomatoes and corn would be the stars of the menu, not just ingredients. People would know the Green Valley name." Ed snorted, looking out over his fields where workers were harvesting what looked like the world's most perfect tomatoes. Easier to sell everything to the city, son. Less hassle, guaranteed checks. I was about to give up when his wife Martha came out with lemonade, and that particular brand of farm hospitality that makes you feel like family even when you're being rejected. "Ed's being grumpy," she said, shooting her husband a look I couldn't quite interpret. "Tell us more about this diner of yours." 2 hours later, I drove away with a handshake agreement for a small weekly order. Not as much as I'd hoped for, but a start. Martha had mentioned their struggles with the big distributors constantly pushing prices down, treating their heirloom varieties the same as mass-produced crops. "Sometimes it's not about getting the highest price," she'd said as I grudgingly helped load a sample box into my car. "Sometimes it's about being appreciated for what you do." That became my sales pitch as I visited 6 more farms that week. Not all of them said yes, but enough did that I started to see a menu taking shape in my mind. Real food, local food, food with a story behind it. By the end of the month, the Highway Star Diner was starting to look less like a disaster zone and more like an actual restaurant. The new booths had arrived, their red vinyl gleaming under restored vintage lighting. The kitchen equipment was still a hodgepodge of old and new, but at least nothing was actively leaking or sparking. The menu took shape around what my new farm partners could provide. Grass-fed beef burgers that actually tasted like beef, seasonal vegetables that hadn't spent 2 weeks in a truck, and fruit pies made with apples you could actually identify by taste. I painted a sign by hand that we hung over the entrance. Real food from real hands. It wasn't fancy marketing, but it felt right. Knowing I couldn't run the place alone, I'd hired Sue, a veteran waitress who used to work at the truck stop down the highway before it closed, and Tony, a line cook who'd been laid off when a hotel restaurant in town changed management. They both jumped at the chance to work someplace with character, even if the starting pay wasn't great. We made a deal, lower wages to start, but profit sharing once we got on our feet. It was a gamble for all of us. My first customer was an old trucker who remembered the diner from decades back. He sat at the counter, ordered coffee and pie, and spent an hour telling me stories about how this place used to be a landmark for drivers back in the 70s. "Your Uncle Frank made the best damn apple pie in the state," he said, poking at the slice I'd nervously serve him. He took a bite, chewed thoughtfully, and nodded slowly. "This isn't bad. Not Frank's level yet, but you're getting there." Coming from him, it felt like winning the Culinary Olympics. Word spread slowly in the first couple of weeks. A few curious locals, the occasional traveler. Nothing to write home about, but enough to keep the lights on, barely. I started recognizing faces. The morning coffee crowd, the lunch regulars who worked nearby. Then came the idea that changed everything. Throwback Thursdays. It started when I found an old jukebox in the storage room, forgotten under a tarp. It took 3 days of tinkering to get it working. But when those first notes of Buddy Holly floated to the diner, it was like the place took its first full breath in decades. I reached out to Mike, a local guitarist who played classic rock covers at the bars in town. He agreed to bring his acoustic guitar every Thursday night for a small fee plus free burgers for his band. The first Throwback Thursday was more hope than plan. I decorated with old license plates and vintage posters I'd found in the office. Martha from Green Valley Farm brought extra flowers for the tables. I made 3 times more food than usual, terrified it still wouldn't be enough, or worse, that it would go to waste. 7 o'clock came, and the parking lot was empty except for Mike's van and a couple of curious locals. My heart sank. This was it. The moment I'd have to admit James and Helen were right. Then, just as Mike started playing Johnny Be Good, headlights appeared on the highway. One car, then another. By 8, every booth was full, and people were standing by the counter. The smell of coffee and burgers mixed with the sound of laughter and music. And for the first time, the diner felt alive. People from 3 towns over had seen the hand-painted sign on the highway. Others had heard from friends who'd stopped by for lunch. One group had driven 40 minutes just to see if the rumors about real milkshakes made with actual ice cream were true. As I rushed between tables, taking orders and clearing plates, I caught snippets of conversations. "This place is soul. You don't get that at the chains." Reminds me of where my grandparents would take us on Sundays. The food actually tastes like food. By closing time, I was exhausted but buzzing with something that felt dangerously like hope. Mike's band was packing up, already talking about next week's set list. The last customers lingered over coffee, reluctant to break the spell. This wasn't just a restaurant. It was becoming a community. The Throwback Thursday tradition grew each week. We added a special menu with dishes from different decades. The 50s night with malts and burgers sold out. The 60s theme with fondue and folk music brought in college students from the nearest university town. Social media started picking up on it too. Instagram posts of our vintage decor. Facebook reviews praising the authentic experience. One food blogger wrote a piece titled Highway Star Diner, where nostalgia meets farm fresh. For the first time since opening, I actually had to worry about expanding our small team. I added 2 part-time waitresses from the local high school for the busy weekend shifts and convinced Charlie, a retired chef who was bored of golf and missed the kitchen heat, to help Tony handle the growing crowds. With a real staff now in place, life was starting to feel good. Too good, as it turned out. The crash came on our busiest night yet. We'd expanded Throwback Thursday into a full Route 19 revival weekend, with different themes and menus for Friday and Saturday, too. The parking lot was packed. Mike's band had brought friends with a saxophone and keyboard, and we'd just run out of Martha's famous blackberry cobbler when the door swung open. James and Helen stood there like they'd stepped out of a different universe. Him in a tailored suit, her in some designer outfit that probably cost more than my monthly food budget. The conversations dimmed as people noticed them, sensing the tension immediately. Helen's eyes swept the crowded diner, lingering on the mismatched vintage dishes and handwritten specials board. Her face twisted into something between shock and disgust. "So this is what you're doing with Uncle Frank's legacy," she said loudly enough for half the room to hear. "Playing restaurant in this nostalgia trap?" James stepped forward, all fake concern and condescension. "Danny, this little experiment has gone far enough. You're destroying our family's business reputation with this amateur hour setup." The diner went silent. Mike's band stopped mid-song. I felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room, along with every ounce of confidence I'd built over the past weeks. "Your family reputation?" I finally managed, aware of every eye on us. "Since when do either of you care about this place?" Helen's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "We care about the family name. This isn't a real business. It's you playing make-believe with Uncle Frank's mistake." I was frozen, watching months of work crumbling under their designer shoes, until a voice from one of the booths cut through the tension. "Excuse me, but who exactly are you people?" Sarah Chun, one of our regulars who drove 20 minutes 3 times a week for our veggie burger, was standing now. She was barely 5 feet tall, but had the presence of someone twice her size. "We're his family," Helen replied, clearly surprised by the interruption. "No," Sarah said, crossing her arms. "This diner is his family now. And ours. We come here because it matters to us, because Daniel made it matter." James opened his mouth, but Sarah wasn't finished. "I don't know what your problem is, but this place isn't yours to criticize. It's ours. It belongs to the community now." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the diner. Martha from Green Valley Farm stood up next, followed by Ed. Then the retired chef emerged from the kitchen, spatula in hand like a weapon. One by one, customers and staff rose to their feet, forming a wall between me and my siblings, not with anger or hostility, but with the quiet determination of people defending something they valued. James and Helen retreated, throwing barbed comment about health inspections and code violations as they left. But the damage they'd hoped to inflict never materialized. Instead, something unexpected happened. Sarah pulled out her phone right there and created a social media post that would change everything. The Highway Star Diner isn't just a restaurant. It's a piece of American history on Route 19. Help us save this landmark from corporate takeover. Hashtag Save the Highway Star. By morning, her post had hundreds of shares. By the next afternoon, thousands. People from across the state were commenting with memories of roadside diners, lamenting the loss of authentic experiences in favor of chain restaurants. What had been a small local success was suddenly becoming a movement. And somewhere in the chaos of that weekend, I realized this wasn't just about proving my siblings wrong anymore. This was about saving something that mattered, not just to me, but to everyone who walked through those doors seeking more than just a meal. Sarah's social media campaign was gaining momentum, but nothing could have prepared us for what happened the following Thursday. I was helping Tony prep the kitchen for the dinner rush when Sue burst through the swinging doors, eyes wide like she'd seen a ghost. "There's some guy with a camera crew setting up in booth 6, she whispered urgently, as if they might hear her from the dining room. "He's got this fancy equipment and keeps talking about lighting." I wiped my hands on a dish towel and headed out front, expecting maybe a local news crew or an amateur YouTuber. What I found instead was Robert Chun, not just any travel blogger, but the travel blogger, the guy whose Road Less Traveled series had over 3 million subscribers, whose recommendations could turn unknown places into overnight sensations. He stood up when he saw me, extending his hand with a smile that seemed both genuine and practiced. "You must be Daniel. Mind if I film here tonight? Your place has been blowing up my feed all week." My brain short-circuited for a solid 5 seconds before I managed to respond. Somehow, I kept my cool enough to agree and give him a quick tour while his camera operator captured every vintage detail of the diner. That night was already set to be busy, but once word spread that Robertson was filming, it turned into something else entirely. People were calling for reservations at a diner that had never taken reservations in its 60-year history. Cars filled not just our lot, but spilled over to the abandoned gas station next door. Robert sat at the counter, filming himself tasting every signature dish we offered. With each bite, his reactions grew more enthusiastic. When he tried the apple pie, made from Martha's heirloom apples using a recipe I'd found in Uncle Frank's scribbled notes, he actually closed his eyes and did this slow-motion nod that his followers would later turn into a meme. "This diner isn't just serving food," he said into the camera as the dinner service wound down. "It's like a time machine, and Daniel is its mechanic. He's not just reserving a piece of Americana. He's bringing it back to life." By midnight, his first TikTok clips about the highway star were already trending. By morning, his full YouTube video had dropped, complete with gorgeous shots of the sunset glinting off our neon sign and close-ups of our farm-to-table ingredients. He'd titled it, "The Last Great American Diner," and the view count was climbing faster than our ancient cash register could ring up sales. The following weekend was pure controlled chaos. Cars backed up for half a mile on Route 19. We ran out of everything by 2 p.m. both Saturday and Sunday. Tony was threatening to quit every hour on the hour until I promised him a substantial bonus and hired 2 more line cooks on the spot. We called in everyone we knew who had ever worked in food service. Martha and Ed's teenagers came to bus tables. Charlie's retired chef friends drove in from 3 counties away to help in the kitchen. Even Mike the guitarist jumped behind the counter when things got desperate. Customers were waiting up to 2 hours for a table, and miraculously, most thought it was worth it. Nostalgia for Route 66 became our unofficial slogan, even though we weren't anywhere near the historic Route 66. People didn't seem to care about that detail. They were chasing the feeling, not the geography. One woman drove 4 hours with her elderly father, who remembered eating at diners like ours in the 1950s. "I haven't seen him this happy in years," she told me as the old man chatted animatedly with Charlie about the proper way to grill an onion. The highway department had to put up temporary signs to manage the traffic. The state tourism office called to feature us in their next campaign. 3 different restaurant supply companies mysteriously found space in their delivery schedules, the same ones that couldn't give me the time of day a month earlier. The call from James came exactly 1 week after Robert Chen's video went viral. I was in the office, finally tackling the mountain of paperwork that success had generated, when my phone buzzed. Seeing his name on the screen made my stomach clench, but I answered anyway. His voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear the fury simmering just below the surface. "You think you're better than us now because some internet celebrity gave you 5 minutes of fame?" I leaned back in Uncle Frank's creaky office chair, suddenly tired. "That's what you got from all this? That I'm trying to be better than you. This little game you're playing isn't sustainable," he continued as if I hadn't spoken. "You've got no business experience, no long-term plan. You just got lucky with a trend that will die out faster than those stupid fidget spinners." Before I could respond, I heard Helen's voice in the background. "James must have put me on speaker. We were just trying to protect the family money from your fantasies. Danny, that property should have been sold years ago. Uncle Frank was being sentimental keeping it, and now you're making the same mistake." The pieces suddenly clicked together. The way they'd laugh at the Will reading, their efforts to sabotage me, their insistence that I sell. "You were planning this all along, weren't you? You thought I'd fail and have to sell the diner to you for pennies." Their silence was all the confirmation I needed. "Why?" I asked, genuinely confused. "You both got valuable things in the will. Why did you want this worthless diner so badly?" Helen's laugh had an edge of nervousness I'd never heard before. "Don't be dramatic. We just didn't want to see you waste your time." But there was something they weren't telling me. I could feel it. "I have to go." James cut in. "Just remember, trends fade. When all those Instagram tourists move on to the next viral sensation, we'll be waiting for your call." The line went dead, but their warning lingered. Was this all just a flash in the pan? Would all these people disappear as quickly as they'd arrived? That night after closing, I sat alone in the empty diner, the only sound coming from the ancient refrigerator's hum. The doubts that James and Helen had planted were taking root. Sure, we were successful now, but what happened when Robertson found the next hidden gem? When the novelty of our retro experience wore off? I opened the cash register to count the day's impressive earnings and found something stuck in the back of the drawer, a yellowed envelope I hadn't noticed before. Inside was a faded photograph and a handwritten note on Highway Star Diner stationery. The photo showed my parents standing proudly in front of the diner, arms around each other, beaming with pride. They looked so young, so full of hope. The date on the back read, Grand Reopening, 1977. The note was simple. This place belongs to those who believe in it. May it always find its way to the right hands. My vision blurred as I realized this note must have been written by my parents. Uncle Frank had preserved it all these years, waiting for the right moment or the right person. I thought I was reviving some random diner my uncle had saddled me with. Instead, I was continuing something my parents had started, something that had obviously meant enough to them that Uncle Frank wanted to keep in the family. Why had no one ever told me about my parents' connection to this place? What else was my family hiding? The next morning, I called an emergency staff meeting before opening. Everyone crowded into the diner. Sue, Tony, Charlie, the high school waitresses, Mike from the band, and even Martha and Ed from farm. I need to be honest with you all. I started perched on a stool at the counter. This success we're having is amazing, but my family thinks it's temporary, and they might be right. I explained my concerns about the fleeting nature of internet fame, about what would happen when excitement died down. To my surprise, no one seemed particularly worried. Honey, I've worked in restaurants for 30 years, Sue said, refilling coffee cups around the table. This isn't just hype. You created something real here. The food is good, Tony added with his usual bluntness. Good food brings people back. Fancy trends don't. Ed cleared his throat, looking slightly uncomfortable with the emotional turn of the conversation. My family's been farming for 4 generations. We know a thing or two about staying power. This place has it. One by one, they all chimed in with their confidence, their reasons for believing in the Highway Star. And as they talked, I realized something important. This wasn't just my diner anymore. It was ours. It belonged to everyone in that room, and to the community that had embraced it. That afternoon, I drove to James's office, walking past his assistant, who tried to stop me with protests about needing an appointment. I found my brother staring out his floor-to-ceiling windows at the city below, looking every bit the successful businessman in his tailored suit. He turned, surprised to see me. Danny? What are you? It's Daniel. I corrected him, closing the door behind me. And I'm not here to argue. I placed a photograph and note on his desk, watching his recognition flickered across his face. Mom and Dad owned the diner before Uncle Frank, didn't they? I asked, though I already knew the answer. That's why he left it to me. That's why you and Helen were so desperate to get it back. James sank into his chair, suddenly looking tired. They didn't just own it. It was their dream. They poured everything into that place. When they died, Uncle Frank took it over to keep in the family. Why didn't you tell me? Why let me think it was just some random inheritance? He sighed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. Because that diner nearly bankrupted them. Daniel. They were weeks away from losing everything when they had the accident. Uncle Frank saved it from foreclosure, but it was never profitable. We were trying to protect you from making their same mistakes. I stood there, absorbing this new information, this new context for everything that had happened. You weren't trying to protect me. You were trying to control me. We were trying to be practical. James insisted, voice rising. That land is worth 10 times more than the business on it. We could have sold it, split the money, all been better off. I leaned across his desk, feeling calmer than I had in months. You've lost sight of what matters, James. Mom and Dad built something that meant something to people. I'm not giving that up for a quick profit. You've turned it into a social media circus, he shot back. You think that's what they wanted? I think they wanted it to live, I replied, and now it does. I left him there with a photograph, feeling lighter somehow. The family mystery wasn't fully solved, but I had enough pieces to keep moving forward. Back at the diner, I found myself looking at everything with new eyes. This wasn't just Uncle Frank's legacy. It was my parents' dream. Every booth, every counter stool, every recipe had been touched by their hands first. As I helped prepare for the evening rush, a plan began forming in my mind. We couldn't rely on viral fame forever, but we could build something sustainable, something that honored the past while creating a future. That night, after the last customer left, I gathered the staff again and outlined my vision. Expanded hours to accommodate demand. A weekend farmer's market in the parking lot to showcase our suppliers. A renovation of the unused back room into a small museum celebrating the history of American roadside diners, with our own story as a centerpiece. We're not just riding a trend, I told them. We're building an institution. Their enthusiasm was immediate and genuine. Ideas flew around the room. Merchandise with our logo. Cooking classes with Charlie. Special events tied to local history. By the time we locked up, the whiteboard was full of possibilities. As I drove home that night, James and Helen's warnings still echoed in my head. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. The novelty would wear off. Competitors would emerge. My family might continue to work against me. But for the first time since inheriting the diner, I knew with absolute certainty that I was on the right path. The question wasn't whether I had enough strength to stand up to my family's jealousy. It was whether they had enough strength to stand in the way of what the Highway Star Diner was becoming. Because it wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to everyone who believed in it. And that, I was starting to realize, was exactly what my parents had intended all along. 6 months after Robert Chen's video went viral, I barely recognized my life. Standing in the pre-dawn light outside the Highway Star, watching staff arrive for the morning shift, I had to pinch myself. The parking lot was freshly paved, the neon sign fully restored to its 1960s glory, and a line of vintage-style gas pumps, purely decorative, flanked the entrance. Cars would start arriving before we even unlocked the doors, some driven by tourists who detoured hundreds of miles just to eat here. The phone in my office rang constantly with opportunities I'd never imagined. A major cooking channel wanted to feature us in their Hidden Gem series. 3 different restaurant supply companies offered exclusive contracts. A publishing house suggested a Highway Star cookbook. My email inbox overflowed with franchise inquiries from entrepreneurs who wanted to replicate our success in their own towns. Most surprising were the corporate offers. Food brands that spent millions on marketing wanted to partner with us for authentic retro appeal. One company offered 6 figures just to feature their ketchup on our tables. Another wanted rights to mass-produce our apple pie for grocery stores nationwide. It was tempting, really tempting. But every time I considered these deals, I remember those corporate fast food chains that started as someone's passion project before losing their soul to stockholders and balance sheets. The turning point came during a meeting with executives from Heartland Hospitality Group, a corporation that owned restaurant chains across the Midwest. They arrived in identical black SUVs, wearing identical suits, carrying identical leather portfolios. Their lead negotiator had a smile that never reached his eyes. "We'll keep the Highway Star name, of course," he explained, sliding a contract across the table. "You'll stay on as the face of the brand. Do some appearances, share your story. Our team will handle the expansion to 50 locations within 3 years." The number on the check they offered had more zeros than I'd ever seen in my life. Enough to buy a house on the coast. Enough to never work again if I didn't want to. "We've identified 17 potential locations already," his colleague added, pulling up a PowerPoint presentation. Demographically matched for optimal customer acquisition. I glanced out the window at Martha and Ed unloading crates of fresh produce from their pickup truck. At Tony showing Charlie's grandson how to properly season the grill. At the regular morning customers who greeted each other by name. What about the local farmers we work with? I asked. The executives exchanged glances. We'd centralize procurement for efficiency, but we could include a nominal local sourcing component at each location for marketing purposes. I thanked them for their time and promised to think it over. But I already knew my answer. Instead of selling out, I doubled down on what made us special. We expanded the diner into the abandoned service station next door, creating a mini museum celebrating the golden age of American road travel. Local contractors restored vintage gas pumps and signs. History professors from the State College helped curate exhibits about Route 19's heyday. We partnered with Ed, Martha, and other local farmers to launch weekend markets in our parking lot. We renovated the storage rooms into a commercial kitchen where we could produce small batches of our most popular items, pies, preserves, and sauces, for customers to take home. Within a year, we'd opened 3 more locations across the state, each built around the same principles: authentic retro atmosphere, locally sourced ingredients, and deep community connections. We called the growing brand Nostalgic Diner, with each location named for its specific highway: the Route 42 Star, the Highway 17 Star, and so on. The Highway Star itself remained the flagship, the heart of everything we were building. Each new location manager trained there, learning not just our recipes and systems, but our philosophy. I made it clear from day one, we weren't building a chain. We were creating a community. The money was good, better than good. For a kid who'd been scraping by on an office worker's salary before inheriting a rundown diner, it was surreal. I bought my first house, a modest place not far from the Highway Star. I paid off my student loans, set up college funds for Tony's kids, and created a retirement plan for Sue, who'd never had one in 30 years of waitressing. But the real reward wasn't financial. It was a feeling of walking into any of our locations and seeing families making memories. Hearing grandparents tell grandkids about the diners they remember from their youth. Watching farmers like Ed and Martha build sustainable businesses supplying our kitchens. We were doing well by doing good, the kind of success story that business schools claim to teach but rarely produce. Until, inevitably, the other shoe dropped. The email from our lawyer arrived on a Tuesday morning. Urgent. Inheritance challenge filed. James and Helen had petitioned the court to invalidate Uncle Frank's will, claiming he wasn't of sound mind when he left me the diner. If successful, they'd be entitled to equal shares of everything I'd built. I was in the middle of back-to-back meetings when Sarah, who we'd hired as our marketing director, quietly pulled me aside. "You need to see this," she said, showing me a legal document she'd acquired through connections at her previous job. "They filed the papers 3 weeks ago, but didn't tell you. They're trying to force a settlement before the expansion announcement next month." The timing wasn't coincidental. We were about to announce plans for nostalgic diners in 3 more states, complete with a distribution center for our packaged goods. The valuation of the company had just crossed into 8-figure territory. I'd built something valuable, and now they wanted their cut. After laughing at my inheritance, after actively trying to make me fail, after warning me that everything I was building would collapse. I was still processing this betrayal when James and Helen walked through the door of the Highway Star the following day, all smiles and designer clothes, like we were one big happy family. "Danny!" Helen air-kissed near my cheek. "This place looks amazing. You've done wonders." James extended his hand for a businessman's shake. We thought it was time to bury the hatchet. Families shouldn't stay angry. They settled into a booth, ordered coffee, and proceeded to act like they hadn't spent the last year trying to sabotage me, like they hadn't just filed legal papers to take away everything I'd worked for. "We've been thinking," James said, stirring his coffee with calculated precision. "There's no reason we can't all benefit from what you've built here. You've proven yourself a capable businessman after all." Helen nodded enthusiastically. "We could become partners. Combine our business expertise with your creative vision. Make this a real family enterprise." I almost laughed at the audacity. "Partners? Equal shareholders?" James clarified. "We are family, after all." As they outlined their proposal, Sarah caught my eye from across the diner, subtly shaking her head. She'd already warned me this might happen. An attempt to get me to voluntarily give them what they were trying to take through the courts. That night, we hosted our biggest Throwback Thursday event yet, a 60s-themed celebration of the Highway Star's 3rd anniversary. The parking lot was transformed into a classic car show. Mike and his band played covers of Beatles songs. Every booth was full, every server rushing between tables. Halfway through the evening, James and Helen arrived with an entourage of their country club friends, making a grand entrance as if they were somehow responsible for our success. They dressed the theme, though their vintage outfits looked suspiciously new and designer-made. As the band took a break, I found myself standing beside the old jukebox, watching my siblings work the room like politicians at a fundraiser. Something inside me snapped. I picked up the microphone Mike had left on his stand. "I want to thank everyone for coming tonight," I began, my voice carrying across the crowded diner. 3 years ago, I inherited this place when nobody wanted it, when it was just a run-down building on a forgotten highway. The crowd quieted, sensing this wasn't just a standard welcome speech. Some people, I continued, looking directly at James and Helen, thought I should sell it for parts. Some people actively tried to make sure I failed. But the thing about this diner, about any dream worth having, is that it belongs to those who believe in it. I told the story of finding my parents' note, of discovering the diner's history, of all the people who'd helped bring it back to life. With each word, I felt more certain of what I needed to do. To those who only saw value once someone else created it, who only wanted it once the hard work was done, you missed the point entirely. This place isn't just about profit. It's about trust, about community, about believing in something when nobody else does. James's face had turned an interesting shade of red. Helen was staring into her cocktail, like it might provide an escape route. "I won't be accepting any partnerships based on legal threats or family guilt," I announced. "But my door is always open to those who want to be part of what we're building for the right reasons, who want to contribute, not just profit." The room erupted in applause. Ed and Martha were on their feet. Sue wiped away a tear. Even Tony, who complained about literally everything, was nodding in approval. The lawsuit dragged on for months, but something unexpected happened during that time. Uncle Robert, the one who'd given me that cryptic warning at the reading, finally reached out. He had documentation going back decades about my parents' ownership of the diner, about Uncle Frank's promise to keep in the family until I was ready to take over. "Frank always said you had your mother's heart and your father's stubbornness," Uncle Robert told me over coffee in the diner one quiet morning. "He knew exactly what he was doing when he left this place to you." With his help, we eventually reached a settlement. James and Helen dropped their claim in exchange for a one-time payment. Far less than they demanded, but enough to save face. More importantly, they signed away any future claims on the business. On the first anniversary of winning the lawsuit, we unveiled a new sign above the Highway Star's entrance, "Where trust serves every meal." It was corny, maybe, but it captured what we'd built. Not just a restaurant, but a philosophy. The nostalgic diner brand continued to grow, but carefully, deliberately. We turned down more opportunities than we accepted, choosing quality over quantity, authenticity over expansion. Each location maintained its connection to local suppliers, local history, local communities. As for my family, well, that's complicated. James moved to Chicago for a job at a bigger firm. We exchanged birthday cards, but not much else. Helen eventually came around, in her own way. She still doesn't quite understand why I built the business the way I did, but she respects that it works. She even brings her kids to the diner for milkshakes, sometimes. Uncle Robert became a regular fixture, telling stories about my parents to anyone who would listen. Through him, I've pieced together more of their dream, more of the legacy I accidentally inherited and intentionally built upon. Standing in the parking lot one evening, watching the neon sign flicker to life against the sunset, I thought about the journey from that first day in the attorney's office, from being the family joke to creating something meaningful, from inheriting a building to building an inheritance. The thing is, value isn't just what something costs. It's what it means, what it stands for. My family saw the diner as a worthless piece of real estate. I saw it as a worthless piece of real estate too, at first. But it became priceless once I understood its real value wasn't in the land or the building, but in the heart behind it. In the end, that's what any business, any dream, comes down to, not the dollars it generates, but the difference it makes. The trust it builds, the community it creates. And maybe that's the inheritance Uncle Frank really wanted to pass down. Not just a diner, but a reminder that believing in something, even when no one else does, might just be the most valuable asset of all.